under the sea, under the sea.
Hello and welcome to episode 25 of Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics, the podcast dedicated to reviewing each and every one of the so-called Disney animated classics, looking at each of them on their own merits and deciding whether they're worthy of making our own refined list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics. My name's Ben, and joining me as always is my good friend Liam. Liam, what are we looking at?
Today, Ben, we are going under the sea and we are taking a look at 1989's The Little Mermaid, considered as the start of a new era of Disney, a renaissance, if you will, and I would argue as well, Disney's very first actual musical. Don't get me wrong, we've had films with songs in it, but this is the first one that really fits the bill of a big Broadway musical. So before we go into this, what is your background and your feeling towards this film before you rewatched it?
This is one of the main ones I watched a lot growing up. I know I've said that for about half of these films, but I watched a lot of Disney as a kid, damn it. My memory of it when I first revisited it as an adult was, yeah, this film's pretty good. And now, watching it in context and as an adult, I can see quite how important and influential this film is. And I think it's important to note, just because a film's important and influential doesn't necessarily mean we're going to praise it and put it on the list. Infamously, we've not put either Snow White or Cinderella on the list. Listen to those episodes for those reasons. What about you?
This is one of the films that suffered from my childhood misogyny. This was the film that my sister liked, therefore it's not a film for me, obviously, and I just kind of ignored it. I'd seen it, but I didn't really engage with it. I think when you're very young, you just kind of watch these films on a very surface level, and there's not much difference between The Little Mermaid and The Black Cauldron. But thanks to a very good friend of ours, actually, I watched this film again in my early 20s, and it had been the first time since I was very young, and she really sort of hammered home like why this film deserved a second chance from me. And it's definitely gone on to be something that I really appreciate for how influential and just how different this is from everything that came before it.
Liam, if you die before me, I'm going to see to it that on your grave is the quote, "There's not much difference between The Little Mermaid and The Black Cauldron." So you are horribly misquoted and misrepresented for all time. Before we launch into the plot then, why don't we talk a little bit about the context in which this film was made and the situation that Disney was in the mid to late 80s.
So you have to remember, this came right off the tail of Oliver and Company, which I think if you listen to our last episode, you'll know we kind of agree is a bit of a nightmare, really, and very representative of Disney in the 80s, where the animation department was clearly failing. It had been moved further and further away from the Disney studios because CEO Michael Eisner just didn't really care about it. He felt that animation was done. And it took the influence of young go-getter Jeffrey Katzenberg to come in and demand better from the animators, and in doing so brought in various people. Now, this is the second film after The Great Mouse Detective to be helmed by John Musker and Ron Clements. But there's a third person whose influence you really can't understate in this film, and that is Howard Ashman, who previously worked on the opening number of Oliver and Company. As I mentioned in Oliver and Company, he was recommended to Katzenberg by his good friend David Geffen, who had worked with Ashman on producing the soundtrack for the film adaptation of Little Shop of Horrors. So this is someone who was Broadway through and through, one of the big up-and-coming names in Broadway. And Katzenberg had actually been trying to woo him for a few years, trying to bring him in, because he recognised that the future of animation was going back to this idea of Sleeping Beauty. In fact, there's a really good documentary you can watch called Waking Sleeping Beauty, which is all about this. And however much I like to poo-poo the attitude of Jeffrey Katzenberg, he clearly knows what works, and he demanded quality in the films. He recognised that Disney was making not great films, and he knew who to get involved to turn that around.
They were like, let's have a film about someone on land with no Jamaican singing crabs. And he was like, let's turn that on its head. Have someone who's not on land with a singing Jamaican crab. And they're like,
And so they brought in Howard Ashman as the lyricist, who brought along his songwriting partner, Alan Menken, who had worked with on a few musicals up to this point. And they decided to bring the Broadway ethos to Disney in the idea of tentpole songs where the film was based around these key numbers that would construct the plot and would move the plot forward. There's There's a kind of a wishy-washy distinction I make between good musicals and bad musicals, where in a good musical, the numbers will develop character and develop the plot, whereas in a bad musical, something will happen and then the characters will sing about that. And I'm going to argue that up until this point, Disney had only really seen a lot of the previous type of songs. Don't get me wrong, there are some good songs, but for the most part, it's let's explain something and then explain it again in song.
I'd say there's a third type, which films like The Greatest Showman fall into, where there's no character development, there's just some songs.
It's even better when you go to the jukebox musicals, which have to laboriously explain it because the lyrics don't fit what's happening at all. I really can't understate the involvement Howard Ashman had in this. Like, it wasn't just giving the structure to the film. A lot of the creative decisions were directly his. You mentioned Sebastian. It was his suggestion to have the crab be Jamaican, and that obviously gave birth to The Number Under the Sea. He finalised a lot of the character designs, particularly Ursula's, and he worked really closely with the actors as a voice director, both in the musical numbers and otherwise, because he just understood who the characters were and what they needed to do. And I really think that whilst the turning around of Disney is down to a huge number of people with amazing ideas who are incredibly talented in their field, one of the biggest names sort of helming that ship was definitely Howard Ashman, who tragically only actually got to work on 3. This is the first of what I like to dub the Ashman trilogy of films, where tragically he didn't even get to work all the way on Aladdin because he died of AIDS in, I think, 1991. And whilst Alan Menken, his songwriting partner, continued to work with Disney, we'll get to those films, and you definitely feel the void left by Howard Ashman, both as a producer and as a lyricist.
I know it's hard to accept that lyrics like Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo could be outclassed, but we've managed it. Just on a side note, Little Shop of Horrors, it's great. The film version of it is probably the best film adaptation of a stage musical there is that I'm aware of, certainly in my opinion. I love Rocky Horror, but I think that's a better adaptation of it. As you say, the other powerhouse duo we've got here alongside Menken and Ashman is Ron Clements and John Musker, who I think we've mentioned previously a couple of times, but they are very much two of the big directing and writing names of the Disney Renaissance. So getting these 4 creatives working on one project was always going to be promising, or at least looking back with the rose-tinted glasses we have of seeing how things panned out, and the influence and the legacy of this film is substantial.
So shall we dive in? I hate myself for that a little bit. Actually, I didn't even realise I was doing it.
I hate you a bit for that as well, but it's fine. We'll have a great time. Yeah, let's start looking at the plot of The Little Mermaid. So we open with shots of the sea surface and an enormous galleon crashing through the waves, and we get a little sailor's ditty, and we're introduced to Prince Eric.
It's interesting that we're introduced to Eric long before we're introduced to Ariel.
You're right, we are, and this is where we get a distinction in the Renaissance, is they realised as an audience we need to identify with what the character wants. Some of the Disney films before have done this. I think The Jungle Book does a really good job because the jungle's fun and crazy, so yeah, of course you want to stay in the jungle. The jungle's great, but we don't get why Aurora falls for Prince Philip, or
we don't know why Cinderella wants to leave this abusive household.
Well, we do see that eventually, but at first we don't see what she wants. Literally, she's asleep and dreaming about it, and we're never shown it. It's only after she's encountered the prince that we see it. So I think establishing, here's this fun, adventurous life that this person lives, it gives us something to latch onto as an audience.
Because if you thought understanding the jungle being fun was easy to latch onto, do you know what's even easier to latch onto? A sexy sailor.
And we get a transition which I absolutely love. So basically, they're heaving fish out of the water, and the sailors mention about King Triton, etc. And there's this fish, and it just looks like a real-world fish, and it escapes out of their hands. And as soon as it gets underwater, it becomes a cartoony Disney-esque fish. And I think it's such a clever transition.
This really stood out to me this time watching it. I can tell you, if we ever do a top 10 Disney transitions, this is probably going to top the list, is that fish going from real fish to cartoony fish. And it's still recognisably the same fish. It's brilliantly done.
It tells you straight away that below the waves, it's a different world. So we get all these beautiful scenes of the underwater life, the anemones and the jellyfish. And then just as the beautiful piece of music swells, we see our first mermaid. And it's one of the most haunting moments. My God, the marriage of music and visual. That might be my favourite example of it in all of Disney.
So I know I spent a lot of the introduction praising underusing Howard Ashman and kind of not really giving Alan Menken the respect he deserves. This is easily the best Disney score we've had so far. Alan Menken is wonderful and still to this day working with Disney. A lot of the films we're going to be looking at over the coming weeks are scored by him, and the music is always gorgeous.
I mean, my fourth comment when I was making notes, Liam, is great film is great. So all the merfolk and the mer people are gathering. There's some big event. There is a goofy mermaid in the crowd. I mean, you basically can't see it unless you Google it. It's there. I don't know why they did. It makes it creepy and weird, as Goofy makes all things.
That has some really unfortunate implications.
It's like a mer dog person. Quarter fish, quarter dog, quarter person, quarter something, whatever the other ingredient in Goofy is.
What's really interesting is in the Kingdom Hearts games, you go around lots of worlds with your companions, Donald and Goofy, and there's a rule of non-interference and you can't let them know you're from other worlds. So often when you go to a specific world, you will disguise yourself to blend in. And when they go to the Little Mermaid world, Goofy just turns into a turtle with his head. And I'm thinking, why didn't they go for the design they already had of the Goofy mermaid?
Well, maybe that's a character in the world of the Little Mermaid, so it's possible that the Goofy turtle can meet the Goofy mermaid.
I would be less freaked out if I met a person with my exact face than if I met a turtle with my exact face. This opening gathering is kind of weird, where Triton makes all of his hot daughters sing about how good a dad he is and how much better their youngest sister is than all of them.
Yeah, my note is Triton makes his daughters perform songs in his honour. That's normal, I guess. I also looked it up. The 7 daughters of Triton, obviously one of them is Ariel, so there's 6 others. Between them, they're voiced by 2 actors.
And they have a total of 1 face design. They do mix the hair up, but they all have the exact same face.
None of them look like Ariel or Triton, somehow. Obviously, being a Disney film, there's only one parent. The other parent is never mentioned at any point.
I really like this number because they're introducing Ariel, and the end of it is the reveal that Ariel's not there. Every time it happens, I question, did no one check the clam beforehand?
They need a better stage manager, clearly. And, Triton blames Sebastian, who's the conductor. How is it his fault? He's sorting the band out. That's his job. And he's nailing it. Give him a break. Let's talk about Triton and Sebastian then. I mean, I didn't need to make a note of this because my main thought about Triton is he's ripped.
Triton is about 80% peck, and I wouldn't have it any other way.
Which is impressive because his bottom half is fish. So that's a really impressive ratio.
The last 20% is evenly split between fish and beard. Yeah, I really like this relationship. Sebastian is kind of a valet, I suppose, to Triton, where he does basically everything for him, and he's a crab.
Well, that was my memory of it, but I think he genuinely is like the court composer, and then he's like hanging around Triton, so Triton's like, right, well, if you want to stick your nose in, you can sort out all my problems and sort out my parenting while I sit here in an empty room doing nothing. Another thing I really like about this number, and it kind of sets the tone for a lot of this film, is most of the musical numbers happen for a reason. So obviously some of these are a bit more tenuous than others, but this is like an in-universe song, right? And it's the same with the Little Sailors ditty at the start. That's like a song they sing to themselves, a little sea shanty. Obviously a lot of Ariel's stuff is she's a mermaid and she uses her voice to kind of connect with people. Later on, Ursula's song is kind of a ritualistic spell. I like that there's sort of in-universe explanations for why there's sound and music and song.
On top of that, they always serve a purpose and they don't feel shoehorned in like a lot of songs in a lot of musicals sometimes do. And I'm going to put that squarely on the shoulders of Howard Ashman, who came in understanding the structure of a Broadway musical, understanding when characters sing and why they are singing, which is not always the same reason. It's very dependent on the specific situation that character is in.
What about that song in Oliver and Company where they go out on the con and it's a song that you and I both forgot was in the film, despite the fact we'd watched the film an hour before? What about that song? I don't know what it's called.
Until you mentioned it, I had again completely forgotten about it. Again, that song is in the film because there needs to be a song here, as opposed to a lot of the songs in this film, which is the character needs to express how they are feeling, they need to convince someone of something, or they just need their daughters to perform for them.
But of course, Ariel does miss the big performance, and she is away with her friend Flounder, who is a yellow fish that's about 90% face. And they are exploring a sunken galleon looking for human treasures.
I really like this introduction to Ariel, where straight away we are told that she is curious, she is fascinated by the human world, and she's in her own world. Like, she isn't purposefully missing the recital. She realizes at the end of the scene that she'd missed it, and she rushes back hoping that there won't be any consequences. She didn't maliciously or purposely skip it in order to go searching for treasure. She just got distracted because that's who she is.
And already this makes her a more complex and interesting princess than literally everyone we've had before this point, whose main characteristics are they're kind and pretty, and that's about it. Whereas Ariel, we've already got a flaw and a motivation and stuff, an actual character.
But all is not well. Whilst they're trying to turn back and check that everything is okay with the recital, Ariel and Flounder get attacked by the scariest shark I've ever seen. He's massive. He's like 5 times the size of Ariel.
Now, my question about this shark is, so Triton is the king of the sea. Not clear how big an area that is, whether that's all the oceans, whatever, right? So, does the shark know that he's attacking the king's daughter? Because I think that shark would be in a lot of trouble if Triton found out. Like, Triton's the kind of guy who will just blast something to pieces with his trident if it's angered him.
I also wonder whether he is sentient, because every other sea creature we see in the film is sentient. And in fact, it reminds me of Tarzan, where there's just the random jaguar that can't be reasoned with and is just completely animalistic.
I mean, there are people like that in the world. Doesn't mean they're not sentient, it just means they're really aggressive.
In that case, I think he's fully aware of what he's attacking, but he just doesn't care. In which case, he deserves to get stuck in that anchor and presumably die.
I mean, I don't know if it's an urban myth, but I remember hearing sharks die if they can't keep swimming, so he's going to die very quickly. I mean, he's probably already starving because he's willing to eat woods to try and eat flounder. That's not a euphemism. He's eating parts of the boat.
But they manage to escape from the shark and head to the surface to visit Ariel's friend Scuttle, the seagull. And this was the last note I made on the film, which just says, I could do without Scuttle.
I think he's okay. I think there's better comic relief side characters coming up. I think there's definitely worse ones. I think there's some funny moments. I think the thing I like about Scuttle is he's just sort of a deranged idiot, but Sebastian does just call him an idiot repeatedly. So I think it's okay when you've got a straight man on screen who's just going, this is stupid. I agree that this is stupid.
I will say I really enjoy Scuttle's role within the film, i.e. to fill Ariel with misinformation about the human world, which at first seems just pointless and nonsense, but has some nice payoffs later. So I'll give him that. And I think the voice performance by Buddy Hackett is really a lot of fun.
So Scuttle gives his ridiculous explanations for what a fork and a pipe are used for, and that sparks Ariel's memory, so she rushes back and gets bollocked by her dad for missing the big show. And also Sebastian joins in with the bollocking, because why not?
If you see the ruler of the oceans doing something, you go along with it, trust me.
Has this happened to you before? While she's swimming back, we also get introduced to Ursula, who is sort of the villain of the piece. She is the villain of the piece, but Triton kind of is as well. And what can you say about Ursula?
Ursula is, in many ways, the gold standard of the Disney villain. There's something so intriguing about her. Like, she's clearly a very evil character with her own malicious plans. But everything about her, the design, the voice, the song, you kind of love her.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, The Little Mermaid is the first modern Disney film, and we've had elements of Ursula in characters like Hook and Cruella de Vil, but Ursula's in a league of her own. If you haven't watched this film in a while, or at all, the best description I can give is if Caligula was a drag queen witch crossed with an evil octopus. I don't know if that helps or not, to be honest, now I say it.
So in preparation for this, I actually watched, there's a documentary on Disney Plus called Howard about the career of Howard Ashman. One of the designers was recalling the fact that when they first thought about Ursula and they started drawing up designs, she was very reminiscent of Cruella de Vil with the sharp cheekbones and very immediately sinister looking. And then one day, just for fun, he sort of played with the designs and he actually drew something inspired by the drag queen Divine. And when Howard Ashman came in looking at all the designs, he was just immediately drawn to that one. He was like, that's the one. And I love that it's really the first genuinely queer-coded Disney villain that we have, which is a trope that people often discuss. And you can do queer readings of a lot of the villains we've had so far, but this is the first one where it was in the lifeblood of the character from the start.
And I think that's one of the reasons people like these kinds of villains, particularly Ursula, is because they are othered in this way, away from these ridiculously proportioned other merfolk who are all either ridiculously buff or hourglass figures depending on their gender. And the fact Ursula is so visually different to this and sort of plays with aspects of gender and sexuality, I think that's really interesting because at a superficial fairy tale level she's the villain, but obviously as you get older and you realise that binary is not real and there's a lot of attitudes attached to that, I think it makes her much more identifiable even when she's trying to kill people.
A trope that is there for a lot of the villains is the idea that their backstory and their motivations aren't fully explored, and obviously we get some revisits, as I mentioned in the Sleeping Beauty podcast, where you get the untold story view of these things, and obviously with Sleeping Beauty we got Maleficent, where they kind of ruined that whole ambiguous backstory. But here we get just enough information where we know Ursula's history and we kind of get that her motivation is revenge, but we don't really get her full side of the story. She mentions that she used to live in the palace and now she's exiled and living in this horrible grotto, and that's just enough where you go, there's something to this character and I would like to know more, but it's not really relevant to the story, it's just a hook for the character.
If that was another C pun, I'm gonna kill you. My big note was, what did she do? Because she's looking at what Triton's doing. She's got her Cauldron and Flotsam and Jetsam, who are two big eels who kind of do a lot of spying for her. So she's kind of seeing what's going on, and she's seeing Triton getting his 7 daughters to perform a glorious performance in his honour, just for the sake of it. And she looks at that and says, like, oh, Triton's wasting all that. We used to live in such opulence when I was at the palace. How did she live if that's not her idea of opulence? Cannibalism?
Maybe she made the men perform numbers and Triton was like, none of that.
2 laws of the sea. 1, you can't interact with humans. 2, only my daughters can perform on stage. Those are the 2 laws. Those have always been the laws. Don't question it. So after Sebastian and Triton are done bollocking Ariel, she swims off and she's not very happy. And Sebastian starts lecturing Triton on how to be a parent. So Triton calls his bluff and says, you have to keep an eye on Ariel now. Your composing duties are hereby postponed. He doesn't say this. This is all implied in my head. And that's what Sebastian has to do. So he sends Sebastian off and Sebastian follows Ariel to her secret little grotto where she keeps all her treasures.
And this is where we get one of the real staples of a Disney film in the I Want song. So again, this was a concept that was introduced to the directors by Howard Ashman, where he said, in any musical, early in the first act, our leading lady is going to sit down on something and pour her heart out, telling us what she wants. And from that point onwards, the audience is going to be rooting for her, and in the end, she's going to get it. Now, people have retroactively fitted the I Want formula to previous Disney musicals, but this is the first one where it was really written in with that intention in mind, and the film was structured around it, as opposed to kind of just segueing into a dream is a wish the heart makes, and then coming back to the plot. And for The Little Mermaid, we see Ariel sitting down on her rock and singing Somewhere That's Green. Sorry, part of your world.
Look, it's fine to rip yourself off. You're allowed to do that. This is a better song than Somewhere That's Green, though.
It is. It's a much better song, and I'm glad Alan Menken found a better place for the music, because it's the same hook.
I mean, my only note on this is Part of Your World is the Disney song. And I'm not just being flippant when I say that, because I think it takes the essence of those big hitting Disney songs, like When You Wish Upon a Star, Someday My Prince Will Come, A Dream Is a Wish Your Heart Makes, Once Upon a Dream. It takes all those and it builds on them so it still feels like a Disney song, but as you say, it does something else and it turns into this I Want song. Obviously, this is a love story between Ariel and Eric, but at that point, she's not saying, I want a man or I want this man. She's saying, I want what that represents. I want to be part of that existence, part of that world, if you will. And I think that's why it works so well and it's so different, because we can't all identify with being attracted to Prince Philip, either the Disney version or the real world version, but we can all identify with there's something I'm missing out, particularly when you're a teenager or a child. There's something out there in this world that my parents won't let me see and that's amazing and magical, but they tell me is bad. Everyone can identify with that, and that's why I think it works so well.
If there's one word that sums up the Disney Renaissance, it is identity, where all of these films, it's usually the key theme is a character struggling with their identity in some way and wanting to belong. Interestingly, Jeffrey Katzenberg almost cut this number from the film. It was, in an early draft, it was screened to a test audience of children, and obviously it's a slow ballad. The animation wasn't there yet. A lot of them just kind of turned off. Jeffrey Katzenberg himself also turned off and spent the number writing the invite list to his wife's birthday party. So great man to have in charge of your Disney films here. But it's at this point that Glenn Keane jumped in and said, like, I can fix this. And he ended up being the supervising animator for Ariel and really did an absolutely fantastic job. And his whole point was that the song is great, but it needs the visuals to go with it. And with the visuals, it was test screened again. Kids loved it. Jeffrey Katzenberg admitted he was wrong. They kept it in. Though by all accounts, I don't think he would have been able to cut it. I think Howard Ashman was very adamant that this was the heart and soul of the film. And I believe he said that, like, you can cut this over my dead body. Like, he would have fought tooth and nail whether or not the animating team came in.
Again, for those who maybe aren't familiar with this, imagine someone watching the first Star Wars film and saying, you need to cut all that Jedi stuff. That just isn't working. Like, that's so intrinsic to what that thing is. I may be misremembering. I think this is the first example of where we get a theme linked to a character. So Part of Your World is Ariel's leitmotif. It's her voice and it's everything about her. So later on in the film, when she doesn't have access to that, she loses, as you say, a lot of her identity. And it's so intrinsic to that character and to this story.
Sorry, I'm just distracted picturing Star Wars without Obi-Wan. The exact same film, you just cut Obi-Wan.
I mean, it is just Star Wars at that point. It's just wars in the stars. Instead of, use the Force, Luke, and you gotta believe in yourself, it's just like, kill them all. They're evil.
The naive farm boy just taking his droids to a Ruffigan bar for no real reason.
Yeah, because from Luke's perspective, he gets the droids back. He gets knocked unconscious by Tusken Raiders. Presumably, they steal all his stuff. He walks back home. Aunt and uncle are dead. Guess I'm just gonna go to a bar now.
Really, Ben, you've designed a better film here.
By cutting my favourite character.
Talking of the animators, this was animator James Baxter's first role at Disney. Well, he worked on Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which was a joint project, but within the animated classics, this is James Baxter's first film. And my word, I've talked a lot about fluidity of animation in the past, but there is no 2D animator out there quite like James Baxter. If you're not familiar, you can see like reels of his work on YouTube, but the go-to example that always impresses me in this film, so he was working on Ariel, and there's a moment where she picks a flower and puts it into her hair, and that's all James Baxter, and the way that it flows under the water is just amazing. And I just thought it'd be worth pointing out that this is his first project and he's going to be working with them a lot over the next few years. Wonderful animator that was worth pointing out.
I think another way this film sets the template for Disney for decades to come is in the visual look of the characters, because obviously in the first few decades a lot of the human characters, they were traced over recordings of actual actors, so they look like normal people, which obviously worked in that sort of context. Disney's always been good with animals because obviously they work a lot from sketches and footage of real animals. I think the problem they've always had is finding that middle ground between something not being over the top and too cartoony, for want of a better word, but also something being visually interesting. And I think, again, Ariel is such a good example of that. She's so expressive and emotive. You believe her as a character is the essence of it. And again, again, the look of Ariel and the other characters in this film, you can see the influence that has on Disney. Even films like Frozen and Tangled, that is just the CGI extension of that way of designing characters.
Are you telling me they didn't trace over a man that is that jacked for Triton?
They tried, they couldn't find one.
And so Ariel sings her song. She wins the hearts of the audience. Again, I've got to point out the lyrics in this are absolutely fantastic. This is world-class lyrics by Howard Ashman here. And as she rises out of her grotto, as the song comes to a close, she notices a shadow on the water and goes to the surface to investigate.
And of course, it's none other than Eric's ship, and they're having a party for some reason. I guess it's because it's his birthday at sea. He's coming back from attempting to woo a princess of a distant land. I find all this very sort of Shakespearean and Twelfth Nighty, a lot of the stuff with Prince Eric and his kingdom, but I think that works really well. Grimsby, his sort of envoy / emissary type figure, has got him a birthday present, which is a massive stone statue of Eric. How he's managed to keep this hidden on a boat blows my mind, but fine, it's a surprise.
He had commissioned it as a wedding present and taken it with them as opposed to leaving it for when he brings his bride back.
Which means they snuck a stone statue of Eric on board. They hid it from him, the journey there and the majority of the journey back, and then somehow they lifted a stone statue onto the main deck. This statue's got special properties, which we'll come to later. The other thing I think... In fact, there's two other things that I think are very irresponsible on this boat. One, they do just have a hole in the side of the main deck. So Ariel can watch them. And two, they do have fireworks, which, to be fair, does bite them in the arse 5 minutes later, but still, fireworks on a ship seems like a terrible idea.
I think this scene is wonderful and also incredibly important. It's not just Ariel seeing this prince that she falls in love with. We as an audience get to see why Eric is worth falling in love with, because he's not just there and a prince. This scene shows that he is very humble to a degree, like he doesn't care much for the statue. He finds it a bit uncomfortable, but more importantly, he's an incredibly heroic character. One of the first things Eric does is an incredibly heroic act, saving the people on his ship after things go wrong. There's a storm, thunder strikes, the boat gets set aflame, and Eric rushes back to save not only the people but his dog Max. And at this point, I think the audience is a little bit in love with him too.
Yeah, he's kind of a badass. None of this Prince Philip where it's like, oh, don't worry, we'll just magic all your problems away. Like, Eric does everything himself.
He also doesn't introduce himself to Ariel in the vein of a pickup artist, so that's one up he's got on Prince Philip as well.
Yeah, that's true. When he sees Ariel, he's not just immediately a jerk. Also, and I feel I could do this as an also for every scene in this film, but this one in particular looks astonishing. I saw The Little Mermaid on the big screen a few years ago, and this scene, the lighting and colour of the fireworks, the explosion when the ship goes up, when the fireworks all go off. I mean, it's just leagues ahead of everything we've had over the last couple of decades. It's astonishing.
I've taken time to praise each of the big players in this, but really how Musker and Clement sort of carved their name in Disney is the understanding of the visuals and making things cinematic. The Great Mouse Detective was incredibly cinematic. Now that they're fully in charge here and have more creative control and more of a budget, we really get to see what they are capable of as directors. And the lighting, the framing of the scene, it's fantastic.
So Eric almost drowns, but is of course saved by Ariel. She swims him ashore and sings a very low-key and emotive reprise of Part of Your World. And just as he's coming round, he sees her before she has to quickly swim away and hide when Eric is recovered by his shipmates. And we get, I guess it's like the money shot of Ariel sings a couple more lines of Part of Your World. You get her on the rock belting it out. There's a wave crashing on the back as the backdrop. It's the mic drop of like, yep, this is the film. Perfect punctuation point at the end of Act 1.
I know you said it at the start, but if you haven't seen this, and if you haven't seen this, why are you listening? Go and watch The Little Mermaid. How did you stumble upon this if you don't know The Little Mermaid? But if it's been a while, go back and watch it. And if you've been watching along with us, the marrying of visuals and score is leagues ahead of anything we've seen so far.
And a lot of what we'll see afterwards. The person I watched this with, like a lot of people, they're aware of it from popular culture and they saw it when they were very young, but they've not watched it sort of in 10, 15, 20 years. And they were really shocked and taken aback by the quality of it. Unlike a lot of Disney films that come after, it doesn't really put a lot of emphasis emphasis on comedy as such. Like, there's some sort of funny, silly moments. There's one sequence which has literally nothing to do with the plot. But for the most part, I think the main characters are very sincere. They're not quipping. Ariel and Eric aren't funny characters at all. And I think, again, that sincerity does help it a lot.
I really can't think what scene you might be referring to.
Well, let's keep moving then.
So Ariel returns to the underwater kingdom and she's completely smitten and everyone realizes she's in love with someone. And this actually makes King Triton is really pleased with this as well. He thinks that his daughter being in love means that she's met a nice merman and she's got over her dangerous obsession with the human world. Meanwhile, Ariel, completely smitten and more determined than ever to be part of this human world, is trying to figure out what to do, but Sebastian, in a panic, realizes he's going to have to convince her that it's just not feasible.
And because he's a composer, what better way to do it than in an absolute banger of a song? We get Under the Sea, which is so good it won an Oscar.
I will say it's not my favourite song of the film. In fact, my favourite Disney song is in this film, and this isn't it, surprisingly. Don't get me wrong, it's fantastic. I do think it's a bit weird that two white guys from New York are writing a Calypso song, but it is the only Calypso number in the film, so I get it. I think there's a worse example of that kind of musical appropriation that we'll get to, where they could have got someone better to do the music they were going for, and whilst the end result is good, you kind of have to acknowledge that. And I think the fact that I'm going to acknowledge that when we come to it, I felt a bit weird watching it today, realizing that I should really acknowledge that it is odd that these two white guys are writing a Calypso number.
Yeah, we've not really touched on Sebastian's accent. The actor Samuel E. Wright, as far as I can tell, that's an exaggerated version of his accent. So I guess it's okay.
I believe he's got Jamaican heritage, and Howard Ashman's original idea of making the crab Jamaican could have been handled very distastefully, and it wasn't. But I do think the end result is good. Like this Calypso number, it's a really good Calypso number.
There's no stereotypes here. Sebastian is a pompous composer, which I don't think is a Jamaican stereotype, unless there's one I don't know about. But I think it's a great performance, and to be fair, I'll forgive almost anything in a song that contains the line, even the sturgeon and the ray, they get the urge and start to play, because that might be the best rhyming couplet ever written.
I think there may be one rhyming couplet that beats it coming up in a film in a few years.
Is it from Hunchback of Notre Dame?
It is from Hunchback of Notre Dame.
I know which line you're talking about, my friend. But yeah, Under the Sea, I mean, you know this song. Aside from how incredibly catchy it is and the fact you've got it stuck in your head just by us mentioning it, I think in terms of Samuel E. Wright's performance, you try singing this without slipping into a Jamaican accent. It's impossible. Even though that's not how the song is written, because the performance is so distinct, you just start doing it.
It's fantastic. And again, going back to that idea of a song needing a purpose as opposed to just reacting, Sebastian here is trying to convince Ariel that the world she is in is amazing and she doesn't need to look elsewhere to be happy. And they get so caught up in it that they don't even realize that Ariel has ran off and they just keep singing. It's a really good sequence with just the wonderful punchline of everyone looking and pointing to where Ariel should be at the end, and she's just gone.
Which is both a nice callback to earlier on where the clam opens, and also a nice little spin on Broadway musical numbers, where that would be the classic ending pose, but of course the main character's not there. After this, Sebastian is called back to King Triton, and there's a bit of coyness because Triton says Sebastian knows something about Ariel that is not telling him, thinking that Sebastian knows the merman who Ariel's fallen for. Sebastian, of course, thinks he's talking about her going to the surface and meeting Eric, and when he lets slip, the red mist comes down for Triton. Which
is where we join Ariel and Flounder, who are back at her grotto, and Flounder has miraculously arranged a present for her.
Now, Flounder's about a foot long, and the entrance to Ariel's grotto, there's two entrances. One she can't fit out the top of, and she's very narrow, and the other is a rock you have to move out of the way, and it's maybe 2 or 3 feet tall. But somehow, Flounder has got this entire 10-foot tall statue in its completeness into Ariel's grotto without her noticing. There's something about that statue that's magic.
What you're missing, Ben, is they had to cut the scene where Flounder goes to Ursula and says, "Can you put this in the grotto for me?" And she says, "Yes. I won't do it for free, though. I'm going to take away any chance of you being an interesting character."
Oh, harsh but fair. I thought you were going to say, I will do it, but I will take away you appearing in the second half of this film because you are barely in it after this point.
So Sebastian leads Triton to Ariel's grotto, who sees this collection of human contraband, and the red mist just descends and he destroys everything.
Yeah, the tipping point is Ariel saying she's in love with Eric, which almost you get the feeling is she's kind of admitting that to herself when she says it out loud. And I think the reason I like Triton as a character so much is he's not just mean for the sake of it. He's not impenetrable. Is every time he does these things, you see the conflict in him, and as he turns away, he looks sad because he's hurt his daughter. He's trying to do the right thing, but he doesn't know how to do it. And again, I think when you're making films that are geared towards children, this is a conflicted parent who's trying to do the best that they can. Of course, parents are going to identify with that. It's a really clever move, because as a kid, you're just like, oh, Triton, what a dick. Oh, he's nice at the end. Whereas when you're watching it as an adult, you can see the levels that he's going through.
I feel parents would more readily identify with the two kings who are getting sloshed and discussing grandchildren.
Oh, how does Triton manage to keep such a good figure and be a parent of 7? Jeez. And he's a king.
And so this is Ariel's lowest point. She's just had her heart broken and her dreams dashed, where she knows that not only is she never going to be part of the human world, she's never going to be happy in the merfolk world. And this is where Ursula sees her moment to swoop in, and she sends her two wonderful sidekicks, Flotsam and Jetsam, to convince Ariel to visit Ursula, and she can help.
Now, my reading of this scene is Flotsam and Jetsam talk to Ariel, but they don't talk in any other scenes. So my reading is that it's Ursula talking through them, right? Not just they pick this one time to talk and the rest of the time they're silent.
It depends. The shark didn't speak in the shark scene, but we're assuming he could if he wasn't such an angry shark.
I said he was sentient. I didn't say he could speak.
Oh, right. I think I like that interpretation a little bit more. They've got a different voice actor for Flotsam and Jetsam. I feel like if they were going for that, it'd probably be Pat Carroll still.
But if you talk with someone else's vocal cords, you're going to sound different, presumably. I've never tried this.
And Ariel is convinced she is at her rock bottom and she'll try anything. She's aware of who Ursula is, the sea witch, and she's immediately a bit taken aback and scared at this prospect. But she thinks, I've got nothing else to lose, so she visits Ursula, who I do wonder how the film would have worked if this was our introduction to Ursula.
I think it would be very unrewarding because I think you need to see these sorts of things. There's been a couple of scenes, we've not necessarily mentioned them all, where you see Ursula watching and spying and plotting. You see her collection of weird little polyp people who her victims that she's sort of claimed in the past. You see her eating a lot and just doing weird stuff. So yeah, I think the setup is really good, knowing she's just kind of lurking there in the background. I think it works a lot better than if she just turned up halfway through the film.
No, you're right. Thinking about it, I completely don't like the film where she just kind of shows up, and that presence in the background is very important. I was thinking whether you could go down a Shere Khan route where you talk about her a lot, but I do think this works better in this context. And Ursula decides that she can help Ariel. She has the power to make her human. And this is just a wonderful example of progressing the story through song, where at the start of this number, this is the first time Ariel is meeting Ursula. And by the end of the number, Ariel is human.
It's great. And some of it is a bit exposition-y. Ursula is literally saying, here's how the spell works. You've got 3 days. Here's what you got to do. Here's going to be the second act of the film. But she does it so well. Again, the lighting in this is superb, and the use of colour. There's one particular moment which I knew it was coming. I was like, why do I think this works so well? So in the first scene we see Ursula, we see her, she's eating these little shrimps, and one of them, she bites its head off, and you get a side-on view of just her mouth as she bites the head off of it. And it's a little visual metaphor for saying Ursula is ruthless and cold and she doesn't care about other beings. And when Ariel asks the price for this spell, we get the exact same shot, and Ursula says, your voice. Just for those 2 words, it's this same shot. And what it says is, to Ursula, Ariel is just another shrimp, another snack to be chewed up and spat out. And I was like, my God, that's so good.
It's wonderful. And one of my favourite performances in the film as well. So it's Pat Carroll voicing Ursula. But if you've not listened to it, there is a demo of Howard Ashman singing this song as he was trying to convince Pat Carroll to take the role. And she didn't really want to do it. Again, Disney wasn't in a great position at this point. So approaching actors, a lot of time they'd just be like, I don't really understand why I'd do this. this.
This character doesn't seem to be wearing any sunglasses. Why would I take this role?
So Howard Ashman recorded himself, and you can listen to this demo on YouTube, by the way, but so much of her final performance is just lifted straight from his performance. Again, I mentioned that he worked as a voice director for the cast, and it's very clear that he has a very specific sound in his mind for these songs and these characters, and he knew how to get that performance out of the actors. And listening to the two versions back to back is excellent. Obviously, we've got the final version with the real voice and all of the effects and the animation, but to hear the performance still being there in this demo is wonderful.
And as you say, the scene ends with the bargain being struck. Ariel signs on the dotted line, Ursula takes her voice as payment and turns Ariel back into a human, neglecting to mention, of course, that she's going to turn her back into a human while she's at the bottom of the sea, so Ariel has to desperately swim up. Again, we get a stunning shot where she breaks the surface and flicks her hair back, and it's all sparkly and amazing.
In Ursula's grand plan, I don't think Ariel dying at the bottom of the ocean would have really worked.
I mean, she's just an agent of chaos. She's just like, yeah, I guess if she dies, I'll just get one of his other daughters.
He's got 7, it's fine. And now we get to the story on the surface where Ariel is now a human, albeit completely mute, which is so bizarre to me because Jodie Benson, the voice actress for Ariel, might be my favourite voice performance in any Disney film. I think she's absolutely fantastic. Again, her performance in Part of Your World is the best vocal performance that's ever been in a Disney film. And I don't mean in terms of like strength of vocals. Like you can look at Idina Menzel in Frozen. Obviously, that's a fantastic singing performance. But in terms of acting and singing all at the same time, like Jodie Benson just nails it. And there's almost like an entire third of this film where she isn't used.
That's true, but at the same time, there's some things I really like about this sequence.
This whole sequence where Ariel is this mute, naive human almost verges on what's recently been called Born Sexy Yesterday, or more specifically just Born Yesterday in the case of Ariel, where you just have this very naive woman coming into this man's world and he just falls madly in love with her. And from an audience perspective, we're okay with it because we've seen Ariel, we've followed her, we know what her motivations are, we know that she's obsessed with the human world. So seeing her up there, of course she's behaving very childlike. I mean, she is a child, but she's behaving very childlike and is enamored with everything around her. And we also get why she likes Eric, because we've seen her see him be heroic and noble and humble. What we don't really get is why this prince is so enamored with this naive, childlike mute. It's a little bit creepy, but I think because of all the context, from an audience point of view, the film gets away with it. But if you were to just follow Eric's storyline, it just really falls into the same problems that films like Splash fall into, where it's like, this man should be a bit more responsible around this clearly very vulnerable woman.
I don't disagree with what you're saying. I think in its defense, there's a couple of things. So one, Eric is still caught up with this enchanting voice he heard. So when he first meets Ariel and she doesn't have her voice, he's convinced she can't be the one. And admittedly, it only takes place over 3 days. Well, really 2, because the last day is just everyone being sad. Unlike other Disney romances up to this point, certainly, they do spend time together. He takes them on a tour of his kingdom, and she's different, and she does bring new stuff. It's said in the film Ariel's 16, we don't know how old Eric is. Let's assume a late teenager, otherwise it's quite uncomfortable. I think the film Tangled does this a lot better, which is also had Alan Menken work on it, because I think there's a very definite point where you see the turning point where Flynn sees Rapunzel as someone he cares about and not just a means to an end. I think this rushes it a little bit, but I think it works really well. You're right, it's a shame to lose the voice performance, but also I think it gives way to a lot of visual stuff, which again, the animation on Ariel's fantastic. We get so much characterization and humanity from her when she can't talk, which again, I think plays up to the strength of this film.
Comparing this to the progression in Tangled, I think all I really need to be okay with this is maybe show Eric be a bit more confused by her at the start. Like when she brushes her hair with a fork and blows smoke in Grimsby's face, have him be a bit taken aback by it. Instead, I'm watching it and I'm like, is this really doing it for you, Eric?
The only other thing I'll say, and again, don't get me wrong, this is classic Disney, people fall in love at first sight stuff. I'm not defending that. I suppose he is conflicted, and there's a nice scene where he's spent a couple of days with Ariel and he's really enjoyed himself and he's kind of appreciated what he's got in a different way. He's clearly very wealthy and opulent and loved by his subjects. And Grimsby just says to him, isn't it better to have what's there in front of you rather than hoping for this ideal thing, which is kind of Eric's character arc. He doesn't get much of a character arc, but that's kind of the point. Up to this point, he's always been dreaming of this perfect thing, and it's actually, maybe it's already there.
Don't get me wrong, I'm probably being a bit too nitpicky. I'm just saying that it's obviously a very good story, but it could have been done a little bit better, and I feel like maybe just having a single female voice in the creative team could have fixed those issues.
A fantastic film that could be done a little bit better. If only Alan Menken and Howard Ashman were going to make another film that's this story, but just make it a little bit better. Oh well, we'll have to see what happens. But in the midst of all this, now, we've spoken a lot about how the songs have meaning and purpose, and then there's Les Poissons, which doesn't contribute anything to the plot or the characters.
Hey, every good Broadway writer knows you need at least one character song that is completely pointless and could be removed from the film. I enjoy the sequence, but it could entirely be removed and you don't lose anything.
It's basically just a mad, very stereotypically French chef trying to murder Sebastian because he loves butchering fish corpses. Now, this sequence ends with the sort of maid of the castle coming in, and Louis like deranged and he's smashed up his kitchen and he's just trying to fight Sebastian, and she bollocks him and he's like, oh, yeah, don't worry about it, and kind of puts his moustache out because it's on fire. And it's never said in the film, but I'm certain this isn't Louis' first episode, that she's like, you are on your last warning because I'm sick of you going absolutely insane over minor things and trashing the entire kitchen, you maniac.
Well, now you mention that, you do cook shellfish alive, and Sebastian is not a remarkable crab in this world. I mean, he can compose, but I assume that in terms of talking and walking around, he's not a remarkable crab in this universe. So you're probably right, and every time they cook shellfish, this happens.
You'd think they'd have learned, really.
So whilst we have, frankly, an unnecessary number, shortly afterwards we do have my favourite Disney number ever, and I think it was robbed at the Oscars.
By its own film.
And I'm talking, of course, about Kiss the Girl, which Samuel E. Wright, again as Sebastian, trying to woo Eric on behalf of Ariel. And whilst Under the Sea is a great song, and the sequence is good, don't get me wrong, cinematically, this sequence, I don't think Disney's ever beat it.
Does such a good job of building up, both musically, where you literally see Sebastian introducing the different elements, and you get more and more vocals and more layers as the song goes on. But it's just very simply the two of them floating on this rowboat, and visually it just builds up more and more, and yeah, it's great. It sets the tone for all your something there that wasn't there before, a whole new world, love is an open door. It all starts here.
Luckily for Ursula though, Flotsam and Jetsam managed to intervene, knocking the boat over just before Eric and Ariel kiss. But now, not wanting to leave anything to chance, Ursula realises if she's going to succeed, she's going to have to take things into her own hands, and so she decides to use Ariel's voice to take on the form of Vanessa.
Yeah, and just as Eric's accepting that he's never going to find the girl with this enchanting voice, he sees her walking along the beach. But rather than just use the voice as proof, Ursula also hypnotises him.
She's not leaving anything to chance here. I will add, I love that this is Jodie Benson again, because obviously Ursula has Ariel's voice. So it's Jodie Benson again, but she's doing a completely different performance. The voice is the same, but the character is clearly not, and it's a really nice touch.
And so she hypnotises Eric into marrying her that day. They set off on the wedding boat. They use this as a phrase as if this was an established thing. I didn't know that was a thing, but fine, I guess. And Ariel is at her other lowest point. Eric's chosen someone else. She gave up everything to be with him, and he's left her for someone else. And it's sad.
Why did Ursula need to marry Eric for her plan to succeed?
I mean, she didn't. She could have just killed him. It's just her style, I guess. I
want a big lavish wedding. Bring out the boat.
She seems fairly indifferent to humans, right? Triton hates them, Ariel loves them, Ursula seems fairly indifferent to them. But she doesn't need to marry him that day, she just needs to keep him hypnotised. Hypnotise him and say, oh, get rid of Ariel, she's rubbish. Ban her from the castle. It only has to last a day.
I suppose it's just really breaking Ariel's spirit because she's mean and vindictive, and I kinda love her.
We get this really nice moment where we find out that Vanessa is really Ursula when Scuttle is flying over the wedding boat. He looks in the window and sees Vanessa singing in the mirror, and the reflection is Ursula, which again is a really nice visual. So he flies back, tells Sebastian and Ariel, and they head out after as we know, the common expression, the wedding boat.
Imagine if any humans had just caught a glimpse of Vanessa's reflection that day.
Humans are very accepting of this. Since Ariel can't talk when she appears on the beach, it's just accepted she was washed up in a shipwreck. And one of the maids is like, oh, that poor girl washed up in a shipwreck. That's the second shipwreck in a few days. That's not a safe port. You shouldn't just be accepting that ships wreck there all the time.
Maybe they thought she was a stowaway in the first shipwreck.
Well, they're treating her pretty well as a stowaway. Oh, you can stay in the palace.
I wonder how many shipwrecked girls they clean up and just present to Eric.
Maybe this is why he's not meeting the girl of his dreams, is he's only looking on the beach. Don't get me wrong, there's some nice people to meet on the beach. He meets his true love, but, he's got a whole kingdom. So Scuttle is tasked with sabotaging the wedding, so he gets all the animals from the Kiss the Girl segment, and they fly over and assault Vanessa and cause chaos on the boat. And Ariel manages to make it there too with the help of Flounder. They manage to break the spell, and Ariel gets her voice back, but just as Ariel and Eric kiss, the sun has already set. Ariel has missed the deadline and is now the property of Ursula.
I love this sequence where the sun sets, Ariel collapses, and it's revealed that she's got a half fish body, and everyone's shocked, but then they've not seen anything yet because Vanessa suddenly just explodes into a giant octopus lady, steals this young girl, and runs to the depths of the ocean. Anything can happen on the wedding boat.
As the common expression goes. It's not my favourite shot in terms of aesthetic because there's so many beautiful shots, but in terms of just what I'm being shown, the shot of Ursula crawling towards the screen across the deck, because obviously she can't walk, she's got octopus legs, so she just has to drag herself by her torso and grab Ariel and jump underwater. And in Eric's defence, he's pretty accepting of all this.
The crawling towards the screen is a really nice moment of just seeing how far animation has come, where there's obviously a lot of 3D modelling happening in the background in these films now. Compare it to Hook climbing the rigging. They're very similar in terms of what they're trying to achieve, but you can compare them side by side, and this is just absolutely gorgeous and so much more dynamic, and clearly just a lot of work and love goes into the animation of this film, unlike The Black Cauldron.
A lot of money went into the Black Cauldron. Don't know where that money went. So Ursula is seemingly foiled because King Triton shows up and demands she release Ariel, but the contract is unbreakable despite Triton's attempt to break it with his trident.
Is that not what you do when you get into a bit of a legal tussle?
Get my trident out.
Get your trident out, try blowing up the contract.
I'd love just you're at a divorce hearing or a will reading and you're just sat there with a huge golden trident. You never reference it, it's just there to intimidate.
And now we see Ursula's plan come to fruition. She even says, as she's pulling Ariel down to the depths, she's not interested in Ariel, she's just part of a bigger plan. And that plan is to trade Ariel's freedom for Triton's, and Ariel can go free if Triton surrenders himself to Ursula, which he does by signing the same contract, which makes me think, shouldn't he at that point turn human for 3 days and try to kiss Eric? I'll draw up a new one. But yeah, at that point, he is shrunk down. Which, just before that, there's a really horrifying bit of animation where Ariel is half transformed. It's just very unsettling.
All the polyp stuff is horrifying. They're really creepy, and it's unclear how long some of them have been trapped in Ursula's cave. We don't know how long mermaids live for, so that could be decades.
And so Triton is turned into a polyp, his crown and his trident fall to the ground, at which point Ursula has won. She just claims them for her own. Which, as someone who is very much into contracts and legal nonsense, you'd think she would understand, inheritance there. It's mine! No, it's his next of kins.
Wait, who's the oldest daughter? I can't remember any of their names. I know Ariel's the youngest, so it's not... This is why I think there was amendments to the contract, but they're also like, from a narrative perspective, let's not spend too much time on the bureaucracy of contract law.
You can't convince me that Triton doesn't have a clause in his contract where if he's incapacitated, all of his power reverts to Sebastian.
So, Ariel seeing this, she attacks Ursula, who threatens her, but then Eric intervenes by throwing a harpoon at her, which, again, I'm very impressed by Eric. He's seeing all this happen, immediately grabs the harpoon, dives underwater, throws it through the water hard enough to wound her, which, again, is very impressive.
This is the thing, is one of the reasons it doesn't fall into that born sexy yesterday is because a common element of that trope is that the man is just kind of there and a bit of a schlub. Like, he's impressive because he's mundane and our female has never seen the mundane. I understand why Ariel is in love with Eric. He is courageous and bold and willing to put himself in harm's way to protect her. It's wonderful.
So she sends Flotsam and Jetsam to restrain him and drown him, but Sebastian and Flounder step up and free him. As Ursula's lining up the shot to blast Eric, Ariel intervenes and causes the shot to hit Flotsam and Jetsam, and we get a lovely shot of just their giblets and entrails sinking to the bottom of the floor. It's pretty graphic. Ariel and Eric swim to the top, thinking they're escaped, but oh boy, are things going to escalate.
What a climax of this film. How do we top this? We go for a giant Ursula who uses all the powers of the ocean now granted to her to just try and crush these characters.
It's great. She makes a huge storm. She gets the sea swirling in a typhoon. She's enormous. She speaks with this great bellowing voice. Eric, ever the man of action, sees Ariel's in trouble. She's pinned down under the blasts of Ursula's trident, and he jumps aboard the shipwreck from the start of the film that Ariel was exploring, and he steers it into Ursula, proving no matter how good a contract you've got, it doesn't protect you from being stabbed to death.
With a boat.
Ursula's last line I particularly enjoy. She bellows in this deep booming voice.
Ow.
Okay, her penultimate line is so much for true love. And as she goes down, there's lightning going through her, and the big tentacles wrap around the ship, and it goes under. It's amazing.
One of my favourite bits of trivia I looked up that sort of thought was worth pointing out is that the lightning shows us that Ursula has a skeleton, despite the fact that she is half octopus, and obviously octopuses don't have skeletons. And I was just thinking, what were you expecting? She's still half human. Were you expecting the human half to have no bones?
And she's got 4 brains and a beak. And she can get herself out of jam gels.
And that's why she's the best Disney villain.
And then we see all her captured polyps turn back into mermaids as they're showered in Ursula giblets. Again, it's an effect they like so much they won't use it twice.
There was an animator at Disney who was really into viscera. They toned it down to get the PG rating, but the original draft, there was blood. I feel all of the people being set free may be a bit unfair. What am I saying? Am I saying that all those people deserve to be polyps?
Are you saying they're still Ursula's property, so she hasn't stated that on her death they get released?
No, I'm just trying to think of who these people are, and clearly no one missed them. The opening of the film, everyone's quite happy to just be at the singing of the 7 daughters.
Well, presumably it's been a steady stream of where's my loved one gone? Oh, Ursula's got them. Maybe I can make a deal. Oh, now they've got me. Basically, what happens at the end of this film is all the most gullible members of the Sea Kingdom re-enter society.
And that's Ursula defeated, but it's not quite the end of the film because, my word, the end of this film, there's a moment and it makes me cry every single time.
And it's not the moment where Louis comes back and tries to kill Sebastian again and Sebastian brains him with a bit of timber.
I mean, that makes me cry, but for different reasons. After all the carnage, Ariel rescues Eric once again, echoing her actions at the start of the film. He's lying on the beach, unconscious, I think. Or is he conscious at this point? She just leaves him, hoping he's okay. And she's sitting on a rock, and Triton is looking on, and he realizes that she's never going to be okay in the water. She not only loves the human world, but he can see that she really does love Eric. And relaying this to Sebastian, he laments that because of how she feels, there's just one more problem. And what is that problem, Ben?
It's how much he's going to miss her because he turns Ariel into a human.
And I cry every time he says that.
It's so good. Obviously, Ariel's the main character, but the subplot is the relationship between Ariel and Triton, this father-daughter relationship. And if you didn't have that build-up of Triton as a character, this wouldn't have an emotional beat to it. And it's great. It's a really good moment. And then we flash forwards a little bit, and we're back on the wedding boat, as is tradition.
Can I also point out, I like the dress that Triton gives her. Ursula was fine for Ariel to just be naked at the bottom of the ocean, whereas Triton gives her this glittery ball gown, and it's lovely.
Yeah, he's a man of class. He knows how to dress his daughters, whether they want him to or not.
But he doesn't. He makes them all wear clams, and that's it.
Well, yeah, when you're under the sea, go back and watch the film again. And we cut forwards, and we're back on the wedding boat, of course. Sebastian gets to one-up Louis by smashing all his teeth out with a bit of timber. And Eric and Ariel finally get the marriage and the happy ending they deserve. We get one more moment where Triton rises out of the water, hugs Ariel. She tells him she loves him. All the mermaids are watching. And the last shot of the film is Triton conjures a rainbow for them to sail off into. And we get another perfect callback to classic Disney. We get a choral reprieve of Part of Your World. What more do you want?
It's genuinely wonderful. As endings go, it's about as perfect a Disney ending as you can get. Again, all of this set to just the wonderful score from Alan Menken. It's just fantastic. I mean, you've seen it. You're listening to this. I hope you all agree that it is just wonderful.
I would not say Little Mermaid is my absolute favourite Disney film, but I think it's probably my favourite ending. Every criticism you can lay about Disney, about it being schmaltzy and it being overly romantic and fairy tale romance, those are all perfectly reasonable criticisms. This in some ways is the epitome of that, but I also think it's the perfect version of that. And over the end credits, which is something all the other Renaissance films mess up because they have a cover of a great song from the film, they just play Under the Sea again, and it's fantastic.
You've touched on the fact that this is very much almost a blueprint for all of the films in the Renaissance, really. And when we look back at The Little Mermaid, it's easy to go, yeah, but they're all like that. What you really have to understand is none of them had been like that until The Little Mermaid. This is the first, and you can say that they had princess films and they had musicals and they had their I Want songs and your fantasy stories of achieving your dreams, but none of them were like The Little Mermaid. This came along and gave Disney a blueprint that they are still following to this day. And yes, it's probably not the best version of that blueprint. I'm not entirely sure if it's my favourite of the three films that Howard Ashman worked on, but you have to admit that for this to follow Oliver and Company, wow.
Before we give our final thoughts on The Little Mermaid, Liam, is there anything else we need to talk about?
There's just one thing, and I've got to admit, I'm really torn on this one. Ben, we need to decide who is the sexiest character in The Little Mermaid. And I've got to say, I'd say it's a three-way split for me, and depending on what day of the week you ask me, I could give you a different answer. So I'm very keen to see who you think the sexiest character is.
I mean, I presume that three-way tie is between Ariel, Triton, and Vanessa.
It's not. You only got one of those right.
What?
You got 1.5 right.
1.5? We often talk about most sexualized characters. I think Ariel is in some ways and isn't in others. There's some uncomfortableness there because, as I say, this character is clearly very young. I mean, she's 16, but also she's emotionally very young. I think they just about get the right balance between giving her a sort of sexual identity and not over-sexualizing her. Triton, on the other hand, I honestly know so many people who they're like, yep, I would. Putting aside whatever I think, if multiple people say to me, Little Mermaid, Triton's hot, it's got to go with Triton.
I am genuinely amazed that in a film coming up, they had to animate the most masculine character ever, and they didn't just reuse Triton. No, for me, it's a three-way split between Triton, as you say. I'm going to also throw my hat in with Prince Eric. There's something about Prince Eric. He's not the sexiest Disney prince, but he's definitely my number 2. There's something about him. He's heroic. He's so handsome. And he stabs someone with a boat.
Do you want me to tell you why I discount him?
Why?
Mullet. And not the fish.
My third one that I'm torn between is just Ursula herself. And that's discounting the whole Vanessa thing. I think Ursula is a very sexy character. Like, it's a big part of that character. Again, they based it on divine, and drag is this whole art form of sexualization of women to the point of parody. And a lot of that comes through. Her song is very seductive and sexy. We get the nice little jiggle. And we've got an upcoming remake for this. And obviously we've not seen it at this point, so I don't really want to pass judgment on it. But with the casting of Melissa McCarthy as Ursula, I believe, something about that just seems like they're missing the point of that character. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm sure she can do that kind of seductive madam approach. But there's a TV live showing of the musical where Ursula was played by Queen Latifah, and that nails it, that performance, where it's like, that's what Ursula is. It's not just who's a larger actress who is popular. It's about the seductive nature of the character, and I'm holding off my judgment until I see it, because Melissa McCarthy is an excellent actress. I'm sure if they want to go for that, she will nail it. My concern is that based on that casting, that's not what they're going for, and they've kind of missed the point of the character, and it's quite upsetting, because as I say, like, that's one of the sexiest characters, one of the sexiest villains easily. So I'm really torn. I think I can happily agree today, just based on those raw pecs, I'm happy to agree that it's Triton, but ask me tomorrow and it could go either way to Eric or Ursula.
Wow, it's a sexy film. A lot of contenders. And we're entering a very sexy period of Disney. I mean, after The Rescuers Down Under, but obviously that's just going to be Miss Bianca. It's still Ava Gabor, so spoiler warning. So let's summarise, because we've talked a lot about the influence The Little Mermaid had and continues to have to this day on Disney, and to some extent cinema in general, certainly animated family features, because the Disney Renaissance template was then emulated in a lot of different formats and a lot of other different filmmakers. But on this podcast, we're not trying to talk about which of these films are the most influential, because Disney already does that itself. That's the point of the animated classics. These are the films that, for better or for worse, influence what Disney is today, and these were the films that were the big cinematic releases. Whether they're good now or not is irrelevant. Whether they succeeded at the time or not is irrelevant. So what we're trying to ascertain is this film worthy of being called an animated classic by modern standards? What do you think, Liam?
Obviously, we've talked about how this film paved the way for the new era in Disney. And yes, every film since has basically followed the formula with a few experimental suggestions. And yes, some films have done it better. But I can't think of any greater praise than about 10 minutes into this film, I put my phone down and just watched it. Of course, I want to put this on the list. It's not only one of the most influential films for Disney and in cinema in general, it really is an absolutely fantastic viewing experience, even in my 30s.
So some of these films I've wanted to put on because I think they're a great example of storytelling or animation, or they've just got a certain charm to them. Films like Robin Hood or The Jungle Book or Dumbo. The Little Mermaid, on the other hand, is a superb film. Not a superb Disney film, not a superb animated film, a superb film. I think if you haven't watched it in a while, you might be misremembering parts of it, or you may lump it in with other films. You might link it with Sleeping Beauty, or think you kind of know it better than you do because it's so influential on the Renaissance in Disney. But it stands by itself so well, I can't fault it, really. Genuinely can't really think of anything I'd change about it. So yeah, it's going on the list. I want to blast it on the list with my trident and write it in gold.
I've got it here. I'll take a few steps back. I'm unrolling the scroll. Please be careful with your shot. I'm not sure what it will do if you hit me by mistake. Are you ready?
I'm going to do it classic Triton, where I'm only going to sort of half look and sort of aim it down my shoulder, because that's how he seems to do it.
Unfortunately, Ben, it appears you missed, and rather than writing The Little Mermaid, what you seem to have done is you've changed The Rescuers to The Little Mermaid.
Oh no! What a tragedy. And this is unbreakable, as Ursula says.
So it looks like the list has got no new additions today. There's no net additions.
I'm still on the fence about The Rescuers. Maybe it can stay on. I don't know.
What do you mean stay on? It's gone. It's been turned into the Little Mermaid. I'm not the one with the poor Trident aim. And with that, that is our discussion of The Little Mermaid. And I have to say, this leads the way for an incredible period. And I'm fully expecting this list to start filling up at a rapid pace. So Ben, next in the Disney Renaissance, what are we taking a look at next week?
We're looking at the film no one thinks is part of the Renaissance. It's The Rescuers Down Under, a film that also came out after The Little Mermaid and before Tarzan. Of course, our views on The Little Mermaid are just one set of views. Maybe we are looking at it with rose-tinted glasses. Maybe our love of the work those creatives put together afterwards and the influence The Little Mermaid had is skewing our views. We're very interested to know what your thoughts and feelings on this film are. And of course, want you to join us for the rest of the Renaissance films if you are watching along at home.
And if I might add, what are your thoughts on the casting for the live-action remake? Am I being a bit too harsh on Melissa McCarthy? As I say, people poo-pooed Heath Ledger as the Joker, and it's one of the greatest performances of the last couple of decades. I entirely think she is capable of doing Ursula. My concern is that her casting suggests that the creative direction of the film is not going for that. So, do you think she can pull it off? Is there anyone else you would cast? Overall, I'm quite excited for the remake. I think the cast looks fantastic. Got Javier Bardem as Triton, which, oh boy, that's a sexy man.
Just so we're very clear, when we ask for opinions on the casting of Little Mermaid, we don't mean racist opinions. We mean in terms of performance, not I'm not happy this character isn't white. I don't think that's our audience, but just to be clear, that's what we're talking about.
And so I roll up the scroll and it re-enters our vault until next week. Remember to join us next time and watch along to see our opinions on The Rescuers Down Under. Until then, this has been Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics.